It began as a hushed conversation behind Kensington Palace walls one that aides tried to downplay and courtiers quickly silenced. But the look on Catherine, Princess of Wales's face as she stepped out said more than any official statement ever could. Pale, shaken, unsteady. Something had shifted, and this time, it wasn't just palace politics. It was personal, and it involved a truth that could no longer stay buried. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. What unfolded in that room was not simply another routine consultation disguised in polite silence. It was the kind of moment that quietly fractures certainty. Inside, Catherine sat beside Prince William as senior medical advisors spoke in careful tones, their words measured, their pauses heavier than anything spoken aloud. Reports suggest the meeting had been called urgently, bypassing the usual chains of palace scheduling, and even more striking was the unexpected presence of Carole Middleton, who arrived discreetly through a private entrance rarely used for such sensitive matters. That alone was enough to raise quiet alarm among those who noticed. Staff were immediately instructed to maintain absolute silence. Communications were tightened. And even long-standing aides found themselves excluded from conversations they would normally oversee. Catherine's reaction as she left was impossible to mask entirely. Those who saw her described a woman holding herself together by sheer force, her composure intact, but her expression betraying the weight of something deeply personal. Later that evening, William was seen moving with unusual attentiveness around Princess Charlotte, his protective instincts no longer subtle but unmistakably heightened. Insiders began connecting patterns, missed appearances, adjusted schedules, subtle shifts that now seemed far more deliberate than previously assumed. What had been dismissed for weeks as coincidence or routine adjustment suddenly felt coordinated, purposeful, and urgent. And as whispers began threading their way through media circles, the sense grew stronger that something significant had been unfolding behind closed doors long before anyone outside the palace realized it. But what truly unfolded behind those doors wasn't just a health concern, it was the beginning of a revelation tied to a family secret that had been hidden for years. For years, it existed only in fragments, quiet concerns, unexplained precautions, and subtle shifts in behavior that no one dared to question publicly. But insiders now suggest that what was once dismissed as coincidence may have been carefully managed truth. And at the center of it all stood Carole Middleton, carrying a burden she could no longer protect her daughter from. The story did not begin with that meeting. It had been building quietly, almost invisibly, long before it reached a breaking point. Those close to the Middleton family had reportedly been aware of something delicate, something that required vigilance and discretion, yet never quite crossed into open acknowledgement. Carole Middleton's involvement, once seen simply as a mother's steady presence, became more than just a mother's steady presence, began to take on a different tone, in hindsight more strategic, more deliberate, as if she had been navigating a path between protection and inevitability. Catherine's public life had always been carefully balanced, her appearances precise, her schedule managed with a level of control that now appeared less about protocol and more about preservation. Princess Charlotte's engagements, while always limited by age, showed subtle adjustments that insiders now describe as intentional, not incidental. Medical consultations, it is whispered, were not a recent development, but part of an ongoing process stretching back months, perhaps longer. Yet through it all, the palace maintained a careful silence, issuing statements that revealed nothing while suggesting everything was under control. The absence of clarity became its own message, one that those paying close attention could not ignore. As pieces began aligning, the realization emerged that this was never a sudden development but a carefully contained reality slowly pushing against its limits. And as that pressure grew, the walls that had held the secret in place began to feel increasingly fragile. And as those fragments began aligning into a clearer picture, the pressure inside the palace walls started to build until silence itself became impossible to maintain. There comes a moment when even the most controlled institution can no longer contain the weight of its own silence. That moment, insiders claim, arrived abruptly, forcing decisions that had been delayed for far too long. What followed was not just a conversation, but a confrontation with truth itself. Within the palace, Urgency replaced caution almost overnight. Meetings that once operated within structured timelines shifted into something more immediate, more reactive. Catherine, who had long upheld the delicate balance between duty and privacy, reportedly reached a point where maintaining silence no longer felt sustainable. William, caught between his role as a future king and his responsibility as a father, faced a dilemma that no protocol could fully resolve. His instinct was to protect, yet the institution he was bound to serve demanded control. Security around the family quietly intensified. Movements became more discreet, and the sense of containment tightened. Meanwhile, media speculation, once scattered and unfocused, began gaining clarity, fueled by subtle inconsistencies that could no longer be explained away. Insiders describe a shift in tone within palace discussions, less about whether to address the situation, and more about how long it could realistically remain hidden. Carole Middleton's voice, steady but firm, became increasingly influential, urging a decision that won't prioritize truth over prolonged concealment. The atmosphere grew heavier, not just with concern but with inevitability, because once a truth reaches a certain threshold, delaying it only magnifies its impact. And as that threshold was crossed, the realization settled in that the cost of silence might soon outweigh the risk of revelation. But what made this moment truly irreversible wasn't just the pressure, it was the realization that the truth carried consequences far beyond the immediate family. When the truth finally surfaced, it didn't arrive as a single statement. It unfolded in layers, each one more difficult than the last. And at the center of it all were two women, a mother who had protected the secret for years, and a daughter now forced to face it in the public eye. The acknowledgement was not dramatic, not explosive, but deeply human. Catherine and Carole Middleton, bound by both family and responsibility, reached a point where silence was no longer protection but burden. What they revealed was not just information, it was vulnerability, carefully measured but impossible to fully shield. The implications extended beyond immediate concerns, touching on Princess Charlotte's future, her role, and the expectations that had quietly surrounded her since birth. Inside the palace, debates intensified over timing, tone, and the extent of disclosure. Some argued for continued restraint, others for controlled transparency, but all understood that the narrative had already begun shifting beyond their control. The decision to move forward was not unanimous, but it was decisive. For Catherine, it marked a turning point, a moment where personal truth intersected with public duty in a way that could not be undone. The shift from secrecy to acknowledgement did not resolve uncertainty, it redefined it. And as the first layers of truth reached the outside world, the realization became clear that this was not an ending, but the beginning of a far more complex chapter. Yet, even as the truth emerged, it became clear that revealing it was only the beginning. The real challenge was what would come next. The moment the truth began to ripple outward, the carefully constructed image of royal stability trembled. What had been hidden to protect the institution was now reshaping it in real time, and the consequences were impossible to control. Media response was immediate and intense, with speculation transforming into analysis, and analysis into global conversation. Public reaction divided almost instantly. Some expressed deep sympathy. Others questioned why the truth had been withheld for so long. Within the palace, advisors scrambled to manage the narrative, attempting to maintain dignity while responding to growing scrutiny. Past decisions, once seen as routine, were now re-examined under a harsher light, each detail questioned, each silence interpreted. For William and Catherine, the pressure intensified, not just as parents but as the future face of the monarchy. Every word, every appearance, every gesture carried amplified meaning. The institution itself faced a familiar yet evolving challenge: how to preserve trust while navigating vulnerability. The ripple effect extended beyond immediate reactions, raising broader questions about transparency, tradition, and the evolving expectations of a modern audience. What had been contained within palace walls was now part of a larger conversation, one that could not be easily redirected. But beneath the headlines and speculation, a quieter transformation was already taking place, one that would redefine how this family moves forward. For the first time in years, the royal family wasn't just responding to a crisis, they were being reshaped by it. And in that moment of vulnerability, something unexpected began to emerge. A shift, not just in strategy, but in identity. Catherine's role began to evolve, her public presence carrying a new layer of openness that contrasted with the carefully controlled image of the past. William stepped forward with a steadiness that reflected both pressure and growth. His leadership no longer theoretical but tested in real time. Carole Middleton's influence, once seen through a narrower lens, began to be understood as protective rather than intrusive, her role reframed by context rather than assumption. Internally, discussions shifted toward adapting rather than resisting change, recognizing that the expectations placed upon the monarchy were no longer static. The balance between privacy and transparency became a central focus, not as opposing forces but as elements requiring careful alignment. Decisions were made with a greater awareness of long-term impact, not just immediate response. What emerged was not a complete transformation, but the beginning of a subtle but meaningful recalibration of how the institution engages with reality. And as these changes took shape, it became increasingly clear that the monarchy was entering a phase where adaptability would define its survival. And as this new chapter began to take shape, one truth became impossible to ignore: the monarchy would never return to what it once was. Every royal crisis ultimately leads to one question: what does this mean for the future of the crown? And in this case, the answer was far more complicated than anyone had anticipated. Princess Charlotte's future, once mapped with quiet certainty, now carried new layers of consideration, her path shaped not just by tradition but by evolving understanding. Expectations surrounding the next generation began to shift, reflecting a broader conversation about the balance between duty and individuality. The monarchy itself faced a defining moment, caught between preserving its legacy and adapting to a world that demanded greater openness. Public perception, always a delicate factor, became even more critical, influenced not just by actions but by the way those actions were communicated. The Middleton family's role within this narrative solidified, no longer peripheral but integral to the unfolding story. What had once been viewed through a limited lens expanded into something more complex, more influential. The weight of legacy pressed heavily, not as a burden alone but as a responsibility to evolve. And as that responsibility became clearer, so too did the realization that the future of the crown would be shaped not by avoiding challenges, but by confronting them. But even as the future remained uncertain, one final revelation would bring everything into sharper focus. In the end, it wasn't a formal announcement or a palace decree that changed everything. It was a moment of honesty. Quiet, unscripted, inevitable. And when it finally came, it didn't just reveal the truth, it redefined the story entirely. Catherine and Carole Middleton's acknowledgement resonated not because of its scale, but because of its sincerity. It offered clarity without removing complexity, understanding without eliminating uncertainty. For the public, it provided a glimpse into a reality that had long been shielded, not out of deception but out of protection. For the family, it marked a moment of release, a transition from containment to acceptance. The strength of unity became the defining theme, not as a strategic narrative but as a lived reality. The monarchy, often perceived as distant and unyielding, revealed a more human dimension, one shaped by choices, challenges, and the courage to confront them. Yet even in that moment of resolution, the story did not conclude. Because truths, once revealed, do not simply fade, they continue to influence, to shape, to echo. And while the silence may have ended, the story it protected will continue to echo through the future of the royal family long after the headlines fade. For years, it existed only in quiet concerns, unexplained precautions, and subtle shifts in behavior that no one dared to question publicly. But insiders now suggest that what was once dismissed as coincidence may have been carefully managed truth. And at the center of it all stood Carole Middleton, carrying a burden she could no longer protect her daughter from. What had seemed like ordinary adjustments in the life of Catherine, Princess of Wales, slowly began to reveal a deeper pattern, one that was never meant to be seen as a whole. Those closest to the Middleton family reportedly lived with an unspoken awareness, a quiet understanding that something delicate required constant attention, yet could never be openly acknowledged. It was not dramatic, not obvious, but persistent. The kind of reality that does not announce itself, but instead lingers in the background, shaping decisions in ways that only become visible in hindsight. Carole Middleton's role, once interpreted as maternal support, now appears far more layered, her presence extending beyond comfort into quiet coordination. Insiders whisper that her influence reached into moments where family and institution overlapped, guiding choices that balanced protection with expectation. There were no official confirmations, no direct statements, only a series of controlled outcomes, appearances carefully timed, schedules subtly adjusted, and public moments curated with precision. Even Princess Charlotte's engagements, though naturally limited by age, carried small inconsistencies that, when viewed individually, meant nothing, but together suggested intention. It is now believed that consultations with medical advisors were not isolated incidents, but part of an ongoing process stretching back months, perhaps even longer. Yet the palace maintained its familiar silence, issuing updates that revealed little while reassuring everything was under control. This deliberate vagueness, often seen as standard protocol, now feels like a calculated effort to hold a narrative in place before it could shift beyond reach. The contrast became impossible to ignore the outward image of stability standing firmly against an undercurrent of quiet concern. And within that contrast, the weight carried by Catherine grew heavier, not just as a public figure, but as a mother navigating a reality that could not be easily explained. The deeper this pattern was examined, the clearer it became that nothing about it was accidental. Every decision, every adjustment, every silence carried purpose. And as those fragments began aligning into a clearer picture, the pressure inside the palace walls started to build until silence itself became impossible to maintain. There comes a moment when even the most controlled institution can no longer contain the weight of its own silence. That moment, insiders claim, arrived abruptly, forcing decisions that had been delayed for far too long. What followed was not just a conversation, but a confrontation with truth itself. Inside the palace, the shift was immediate, almost unsettling in its urgency. What had once been carefully paced and quietly managed began accelerating beyond the comfort of protocol. Senior figures were called into discussions that carried a different tone, less measured, more urgent, and impossible to dismiss. At the center of it all stood Catherine, Princess of Wales, no longer willing to carry the burden of silence without question. Reports suggest she pushed for clarity, not recklessness, but a controlled honesty that acknowledged reality without surrendering stability. It was a bold position, one that placed her at the intersection of personal truth and institutional expectation. Beside her, Prince William found himself navigating an internal conflict that could not be resolved through duty alone. His role demanded composure, restraint, and alignment with the long-standing traditions that had defined the monarchy for generations. But as a father, his instinct was far more immediate, far more protective. Those two forces did not align easily. Insiders describe a growing tension in his decisions, moments where hesitation revealed just how high the stakes had become. Every choice carried weight, not just for the present, but for what it might mean moving forward. At the same time, security around the family quietly intensified. Movements became more controlled, appearances more deliberate, and access more restricted. These were not dramatic changes, but they were noticeable to those paying attention. Subtle shifts that signaled something significant unfolding beneath the surface. Meanwhile, media speculation reached a level that could no longer be contained by routine statements or carefully worded reassurances. Questions became sharper, patterns more obvious, and the narrative harder to control. What had once been scattered whispers now began forming a more focused and persistent inquiry. Amid this growing pressure, Carole Middleton's influence became increasingly central. She was not acting from within the institution, yet her presence carried undeniable weight. Insiders claim she pushed for unity, urging a decision that would prioritize family cohesion over prolonged uncertainty. It was not a demand for exposure, but a recognition that silence was no longer sustainable. Her perspective added a new dimension to the discussions, one that balanced emotional reality with practical consequence. The atmosphere inside the palace shifted from controlled management to something far more fragile, a state where every delay risked amplifying the eventual impact. The realization began to settle in that this was not a situation that could be quietly resolved behind closed doors. It had already reached a point where its influence extended beyond the immediate circle, touching the broader perception of the monarchy itself. And once that line was crossed, there was no easy return. But what made this moment truly irreversible wasn't just the pressure, it was the realization that the truth carried consequences far beyond the immediate family. When the truth finally surfaced, it didn't arrive as a single statement. It unfolded in layers, each one more difficult than the last. And at the center of it all were two women, a mother who had protected the secret for years, and a daughter now forced to face it in the public eye. The moment did not come with spectacle or grand declaration, but with a quiet, undeniable shift that could be felt rather than announced. Catherine, Princess of Wales, and Carole Middleton stood at the intersection of responsibility and reality, bound by a shared understanding that the time for silence had passed. Reports suggest their acknowledgement was not impulsive, but the result of countless private conversations, each one weighing the cost of truth against the burden of concealment. What they revealed was not simply information, it was the emotional weight of years spent navigating a delicate balance, protecting not only a child but an entire narrative that had been carefully held together. For Catherine, the shift carried a profound personal cost. She was no longer just managing a private concern within the safety of family walls. She was stepping into a position where that reality would inevitably be interpreted, analyzed, and questioned by a world that rarely offers understanding without scrutiny. The emotional toll of that transition was impossible to ignore. Insiders describe moments of quiet resolve, where strength was not defined by certainty, but by the willingness to move forward despite it. Carole Middleton, who had long acted as a steady force behind the scenes, now found herself sharing that burden in a more visible way, her role evolving from quiet protector to active participant in a decision that would reshape everything. The implications extended beyond the immediate moment, reaching into the future of Princess Charlotte. What had once been a path guided by tradition now carried new layers of complexity. Expectations that had seemed fixed began to shift, raising questions not only about her role, but about how that role would adapt to a reality that could no longer be fully shielded. Within the palace, discussions intensified, not around whether to acknowledge the truth, but around how to do so without destabilizing the institution itself. Timing became critical, language carefully considered, and every decision measured against its potential impact. Some voices argued for restraint, fearing the consequences of too much exposure, while others recognized that partial truth could be just as damaging as silence. What ultimately emerged was a controlled disclosure, not a complete unveiling, but a deliberate step toward transparency. It was a calculated move, one that sought to balance honesty with protection, reality with stability. Family unity became the guiding force, not as a strategy but as a necessity. In that unity there was strength, but also vulnerability, because standing together meant facing the consequences together. And as that truth began to take shape in the public consciousness, it became clear that the story was no longer contained within the palace. It had entered a space where perception would shape reality just as much as fact. Yet even as the truth emerged, it became clear that revealing it was only the beginning. The real challenge was what would come next. The moment the truth began to ripple outward, the carefully constructed image of royal stability trembled. What had been hidden to protect the institution was now reshaping it in real time, and the consequences were impossible to control. What started as controlled acknowledgement quickly expanded into something far larger, moving beyond the palace and into a global conversation that no amount of preparation could fully contain. Reports suggest that media outlets across continents seized on every detail, every nuance, building narratives that ranged from deeply sympathetic to sharply critical. The story no longer belonged solely to the family. It had become public, dissected, debated, and reinterpreted in ways that could not be predicted. For the public, the reaction was immediate and divided. Some responded with empathy, recognizing the emotional weight carried by Catherine, Princess of Wales, and her family, understanding that behind the institution were individuals navigating something profoundly personal. Others, however, questioned the silence that had preceded the revelation, asking why such a truth had been held back for so long. That tension between compassion and skepticism created a volatile atmosphere, one where every new piece of information seemed to deepen the divide rather than resolve it. Inside the palace, the response was no less intense. Advisors who had long operated with precision and control suddenly found themselves reacting rather than directing. Strategies that once relied on careful timing and measured communication were forced to adapt to a pace dictated by external pressure. Insiders describe a sense of urgency that bordered on relentless, with teams working to maintain coherence in a narrative that was constantly shifting. The challenge was no longer just about protecting the institution, it was about preserving credibility in the face of growing scrutiny. That scrutiny extended backward, casting a new light on past decisions that had once gone unquestioned. Actions that were previously seen as routine now appeared deliberate, each one re-examined through the lens of what had been revealed. The consistency of past messaging, the timing of appearances, even moments of absence all became part of a larger analysis that sought to understand not just what had happened, but how it had been managed. For the monarchy, this was not just a moment of exposure, but a test of its ability to withstand it. At the center of this storm stood Prince William and Catherine, now facing a level of pressure that extended far beyond personal responsibility. As the future of the monarchy, their response carried implications that reached into the very foundation of public trust. Every decision they made moving forward would be measured not only by its immediate impact, but by what it signaled about the institution they were preparing to lead. The weight of expectation grew heavier, not because of a single moment, but because of everything that moment represented. And yet, even as the noise intensified and the stakes rose higher, something quieter began to take shape beneath the surface, a shift that was not driven by headlines or speculation, but by necessity. Because in the midst of uncertainty, the only path forward was not to restore what had been, but to redefine what could be. But beneath the headlines and speculation, a quieter transformation was already taking place, one that would redefine how this family moves forward. For the first time in years, the royal family wasn't just responding to a crisis, they were being reshaped by it. And in that moment of vulnerability, something unexpected began to emerge. A shift not just in strategy, but in identity. The weight of everything that had unfolded did not simply settle into silence. It began to change the way decisions were made, the way roles were understood, and the way the future itself was being imagined. At the center of this transformation stood Catherine, Princess of Wales, no longer positioned solely as a figure of composure, but as someone willing to embrace a more open and grounded presence. Reports suggest that her approach began to evolve, not in dramatic gestures, but in subtle choices that signaled a quiet departure from the rigid expectations that had once defined her role. What had once been carefully guarded now carried a new tone, measured honesty, replacing controlled distance. Alongside her, Prince William stepped into a level of leadership that could no longer be deferred. The pressures surrounding him were no longer theoretical or distant, they were immediate, demanding clarity, resilience, and a willingness to adapt. Insiders describe a shift in his presence, one that reflected not just responsibility, but a deeper understanding of what leadership required in moments of uncertainty. It was no longer about maintaining tradition without question, it was about ensuring that tradition could endure by evolving. That shift did not come easily. It carried the weight of expectation, the challenge of scrutiny, and the reality that every decision would shape how the monarchy was perceived moving forward. At the same time, Carole Middleton's role began to be seen through a different lens. What had once been interpreted by some as overreach or excessive involvement was now understood as something far more grounded, a protective instinct shaped by years of quiet vigilance. Her influence, once questioned, now appeared essential in navigating a situation where emotional clarity mattered as much as institutional stability. Insiders suggest that her presence provided a sense of balance, ensuring that decisions were not made in isolation from the human realities they affected. Within the palace, this shift extended beyond individuals into the structure itself. Conversations began to move toward rethinking how sensitive matters were handled, recognizing that the old methods of containment were no longer sufficient in a world where information moved faster than control. There was a growing acknowledgement that maintaining trust required more than silence. It required a willingness to engage with complexity rather than avoid it. This did not mean abandoning tradition, but redefining how it operated within a changing environment. Gradually, a new rhythm began to form, one that balanced discretion with openness, structure with adaptability. It was not a complete transformation, but it was unmistakable. The monarchy, long defined by its resistance to change, was beginning to show signs of movement not forced, but necessary. And as these changes took root, The contrast between what had been and what was emerging became increasingly clear. Because once an institution begins to evolve from within, it cannot simply return to its previous state. And as this new chapter began to take shape, one truth became impossible to ignore: the monarchy would never return to what it once was. Every royal crisis ultimately leads to one question: what does this mean for the future of the crown? And in this case, the answer was far more complicated than anyone had anticipated. What began as a deeply personal matter had now expanded into something far greater, touching the very foundation of how the monarchy defines itself across generations. At the center of this evolving reality stood Princess Charlotte, whose future role, once shaped by clear expectations, now carried a new level of uncertainty. The path ahead was no longer simply about tradition, but about adaptation. Insiders suggest that conversations surrounding her position began to shift quietly, not in a way that disrupted protocol outright, but in a manner that acknowledged a changing landscape. What had once seemed predetermined now required reconsideration, and with that came a sense of both responsibility and restraint. For Catherine, Princess of Wales, and Prince William, this shift was deeply personal as well as profoundly public. They were no longer preparing for a future built solely on continuity; they were stepping into one shaped by transformation. The expectations placed upon them extended beyond leadership. They were now seen as the architects of a monarchy that needed to evolve without losing its identity. That balance was not easy to maintain. It required careful judgment, an understanding of public sentiment, and the ability to navigate a space where tradition and change often stand in quiet opposition. The broader question began to take form: how does an institution rooted in centuries of continuity respond to a moment that demands redefinition? The answer, it seemed, lay not in abandoning its foundations, but in reinterpreting them. Public perception, once anchored in stability and predictability, began to shift toward a more nuanced understanding. The monarchy was no longer viewed solely as an unchanging symbol; it was being seen as something capable of adjustment, even if that adjustment came with tension. And that tension, while challenging, carried the potential for renewal. At the same time, the balance between privacy and public duty became increasingly complex. What had once been carefully protected was now part of a broader narrative, one that could not be easily contained. The expectation for transparency grew stronger, yet so did the need to preserve personal boundaries. Navigating that balance required a new approach, one that acknowledged both the rights of the individual and the responsibilities of the institution. It was not a perfect alignment, but it was a necessary one. Amid all of this, the Middleton family's influence took on a lasting significance. Their role, once viewed as external to the monarchy, became woven into its ongoing story. Carole Middleton's decisions, Catherine's resilience, and the family's collective response left an imprint that extended beyond the immediate moment. It reshaped how the monarchy interacts with those closest to it, redefining the boundaries between personal and public life. As the implications continued to unfold, one reality became clear: the future of the crown would not be defined by avoiding moments like this, but by how it responds to them. The legacy being shaped was no longer just about preservation; it was about evolution. And within that evolution lay both uncertainty and possibility, each influencing the other in ways that could not yet be fully understood. But even as the future remained uncertain, one final revelation would bring everything into sharper focus. In the end, it wasn't a formal announcement or a palace decree that changed everything. It was a moment of honesty. Quiet, unscripted, inevitable. And when it finally came, it didn't just reveal the truth, it redefined the story entirely. The weight of everything that had built up behind closed doors found its release not in spectacle, but in something far more powerful: acknowledgement. Catherine, Princess of Wales, and Carole Middleton, bound by years of quiet endurance, reached a point where silence no longer served its purpose. Reports suggest that final acknowledgement was not about revealing every detail, but about lifting the burden of concealment that had shaped so many decisions. It was a moment defined not by control, but by acceptance. For Catherine, it marked the end of one chapter and the beginning of another one, where strength was no longer measured by how much could be hidden, but by how much could be faced. The emotional closure that followed was not absolute. It carried with it a lingering uncertainty, a recognition that while The truth had been acknowledged. Its implications would continue to unfold. That complexity did not weaken the moment it made it real. Insiders describe a shift not just in perception but in atmosphere, as if something long held in tension had finally been allowed to settle, even if only partially. The public, once caught between speculation and assumption, began to understand a deeper reality. What had initially been viewed through the lens of curiosity or skepticism gradually transformed into something more nuanced. There was a growing awareness that behind every decision, every silence, there had been a human story unfolding, one shaped by care, by fear, and by the desire to protect. That understanding did not erase questions, but it changed the tone in which they were asked. At the heart of it all was the strength of family unity, not as a constructed narrative, but as a lived experience that had guided every step along the way. Catherine and Carole Middleton stood not just as individuals, but as a reflection of what it means to navigate something deeply personal under the weight of public expectation. Their unity became the defining thread, one that held steady even as everything around it shifted. And in that unity, there was a quiet power, one that resonated far beyond the immediate moment. For the monarchy, this marked a turning point. The way truths are handled, the balance between privacy and transparency, the understanding of what the public expects, none of it remained unchanged. This was not a complete transformation, but it was a significant one. A moment that would influence decisions long after the immediate impact had passed. The institution, shaped by centuries of tradition, had encountered a reality that demanded adaptation, and in responding to it, had begun to evolve. As this chapter came to a close, it became clear that the story was not ending, it was continuing in a different form. The silence that once defined it had given way to something more open, more complex, and perhaps more human. And in that shift, the monarchy stepped into a new era, one shaped not just by tradition, but by the courage to face what cannot be hidden. And while the silence may have ended, the story it protected will continue to echo through the future of the royal family long after the headlines fade. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next one.